Morning everyone. In today's video we'll be looking at nomenclature in J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls. Essentially we'll be looking at possible reasons why Priestley may have named the characters and what their names might reveal to us about their personalities and plot lines. I'll put a link below to the slides in case you want them. Let's get started. So what is nomenclature exactly? It literally means the naming of things, so what things are called and why. Writers use it a lot when naming characters. Often we can tell something about a character from what their name means, or about the sound of the name, or something like that. Everyone from Charles Dickens to J.K. Rowling uses this technique to hint to their readers about the nature of a character. And Priestley too. In a book that he wrote about theatre and theatre productions, Priestley wrote, "In a good theatrical production, everything in it, down to the smallest detail, is significant. A startled look, a cough, a turn of the head, none of these is accidental and each has its own significance." So he's telling us here that a significant amount of thought goes into everything on the page. Everything is considered and is there for a reason. And as students of literature, it's our job to theorise what these reasons might be. So let's start with the surname of the family in the play, the Birlings. Let's look at the definitions first, and then we'll look at potential inferences. Now, Birling is actually a verb, and it means to spin. Birling is also a game, sometimes played by lumberjacks. Basically, two lumberjacks stand on a log that's floating in the water. They spin, or burl, the log with their feet, trying to get the other to fall off. You can watch videos of it on YouTube if you search for World Championship log rolling. In musical terms, birling is sort of like a whirring sound that fluctuates between two notes. And a different spelling slightly, but birling with a U is a manufacturing term for when you remove all of the knots and loose threads and the less desirable parts from a piece of material such as cloth. Right, that's great. It's got lots of different definitions. But so what? How is any of this relevant? We can only use this information if we can make it relevant to the Birling family, right? So let's try. Maybe we could say that the game where people try and get competitors to fall off the log is a metaphor. Maybe we could say that this represents how the older and the younger generations are battling for moral dominance at the end of the play after the inspector leaves. Could this be a bit of foreshadowing from Priestley? Could the fluctuation between two musical notes be a metaphor for the fluctuations between capitalism and socialism in society? Or even a character such as Sheila who seems to change her outlook in the play? What about the removal of knots? Well, there's already a link to Eva Smith with the working class job role and the Industrial Revolution era job, but maybe this is a metaphor for the Birlings' attitudes towards Eva Smith. Like the knots in the cotton, she is seen as less than desirable and needs to be removed, which could explain why they all treat her horribly. Let's look at Arthur next. Depending on which source we use, Arthur can mean a few different things. It could mean stone, it could mean bear, and it could mean noble due to the links with King Arthur. Now we could say maybe that stone is a reference to his cold attitude towards Eva Smith and his heartless treatment and views of those in the working class. But what can we get from bear? Well, we know that bears are pretty strong, fiercely protective of their families, and can be quite ruthless. Can we link any of that to Mr. Birling? Absolutely. He's quite harsh and ruthless in his treatment of the workers. He's fiercely protective of his cubs when the inspector tries to interrogate them, and he certainly sees himself as a strong and powerful individual with his repeated references to being Lord Mayor and his repeated attempts to give advice to the younger generation. King Arthur? Maybe this is a bit of irony on Priestley's part. Mr. Birling is far from noble in his actions and attitudes. And it's interesting that King Arthur is famed for using a round table, symbolising equality, which seems quite socialist, really, so going completely against the capitalist Mr. Birling, who seems obsessed with hierarchy and status. What about Sybil, Mrs. Birling? Sybil means prophetess or oracle, probably why J.K. Rowling used the name for a professor of divination in Harry Potter. Sibyls were essentially like priestesses in ancient civilizations that interpreted the wills and the wishes of the gods. For example, in ancient Greece, there was a story known as the Sybil and Apollo, which was about an old woman who made predictions about the future, but she didn't quite see the bigger picture, and it all eventually comes crashing down on her. Could we say the same about Sybil Birling, an older woman who doesn't quite see the bigger picture? Absolutely. It could also be a link to her arrogant attitude, or the fact that she thought she knew it all, but didn't realise her son was the father of the baby. Or, with the link between the Sibyls and the gods, maybe we could even say that Sybil Birling plays God by deciding Eva's fate at the charity, essentially sentencing her to death. Sheila next. Sheila has a few different meanings. It could mean blind, shining one, or even heavenly. But how can we link these to the character? Maybe Sheila's blind at the start of the play. She's quite naive, and she doesn't quite see how the ideologies and attitudes of her family are harming others. But then, after the inspector shows her the way, she goes on a bit of a moral journey. Eventually, she comes out of the situation shining. We see her in a very positive way due to her growth as a character. She shines. And if you subscribe to the idea that the inspector is actually a metaphor for God, or a godlike figure, then it would make sense to refer to Sheila's character as the heavenly one, because she essentially takes the place of the inspector after he leaves the house. Finding this useful so far? It would help me immensely if you like the video or subscribe to the channel. Liking and subscribing boosts the channel and the video, meaning that it can be seen by more people, and more people can be helped with their revision, which is the whole goal of this channel. Eric next. Eric is an Old Norse or Viking name meaning ever powerful or the one ruler. And in Ireland, an Eric was also the compensation that a murderer had to pay to the family of the victim. Pretty interesting meanings, really. Now, could the ever-powerful ruler angle be a link to Eric's relationship with Eva Smith? He holds all of the power in that relationship. He has the money. She's dependent on him. He's in the upper class, she's in the lower. He threatens to make a scene unless she lets him into the house. He's definitely the powerful one in that relationship. But what about the blood money reference? Could this be a foreshadowed link to the money that he steals from his dad to give to Eva? Or could it just be a name that links to money, just a stereotypical capitalist trait, sort of like calling your child cash or penny or dollar or something? Right, that's the Birling family done. Let's look at Gerald Croft next. Gerald means the ruler of the spear, and Croft comes from craft, meaning a smart or cunning person. That's where we get the word crafty from. So essentially, his name means a cunning ruler of the spear. How can we make this relevant? There aren't any spears in an Inspector Calls. Well, maybe it could be a reference to the power of his family. Even the arrogant Mr. Birling seems to respect and revere the Crofts. The violent connotations of the spear could maybe be a reference to how he hurts the women in his life, such as Sheila and Daisy. Or maybe just a straight up reference to his relationship with Daisy. His name means ruler, and he seems to rule their relationship. She loves him, and he just uses her. She's 100% reliant on him, as she is living in accommodation that he controls. The fact that he's crafty could be a reference to how it is him that works out that maybe the inspector wasn't real, which leads to the plot unravelling and that maybe there wasn't actually a woman in the infirmary. Or perhaps it's a reference to his deceptive nature in the affair that he had. What about Goole? Well, Goole is a market town in Yorkshire. Goole is phonetically the same as ghoul, a type of ghost, and Goole comes from Goole, meaning a stream or an outlet drain. So what? How can we apply these seemingly random scraps of information to the character of the inspector? Well, Yorkshire, the county that Priestley was born in, is primarily a working class county. It certainly was in 1912 when the play was set. Goole is less than an hour away from where Priestley was born and grew up. So maybe this could back up the theory that the inspector acts as a voice for the working class in the novel, the faceless John Smiths and Eva Smiths that he references in his final speech. For Goole, as in ghost, think about the twist ending in An Inspector Calls, the mysterious nature of it, and all of the questions that it raises about the inspector. Could this be referenced by the ghost-like nature of his name? And if you think of an outlet drain as being the end of the pipe where the sewage comes out, we could maybe say that this is a link to the inspector's mission of flushing out capitalism, or even the fresh and inviting stream or river of socialism that he wanted to flood society with. We'll talk about both of the victims' names, but let's start with Eva Smith. Eva comes from the name Eve, as in the biblical Eve, and it means mother of life, or just life. And Smith is the most common surname in Britain. It's short for blacksmith. So, put these together, and Eva Smith near enough means common life, a reference to the fact that the character is a metaphor for the entire working class in this microcosm of 1912 society. Could the mother meaning be a reference to the fact that Eva dies while she was pregnant? Could the feminine meaning of a name be a nod to Eva being a metaphor for the plight of all women in the early 20th century? Or is there a meaning in the biblical nature of a name? What about Smith, as in blacksmith? This is a pretty working class job, so could be again a reference to the fact that she's a representation of the working class. But what about Eva's alter ego, Daisy Renton? Let's split it up. So a daisy is a fairly common flower in Britain. So common, in fact, that some people see it as a weed. Daisies can represent rebirth and motherhood. They were the sacred flower of Freya, the Viking goddess of love and beauty. Daisy literally means day's eye, as in the eye of the day, because they close their petals at night and open them up again in the sun. So again, linking to life, rebirth, purity, life cycle. But then when you think about phrases such as pushing up daisies, we realise that daisies can also be a symbol of death. There are a bunch of other meanings to daisies as well. Think about when a small child falls over or something, you might say, whoops a daisy. So maybe daisies could be references to accidents or things that have gone wrong. So could this rebirth symbolism be a nod to the fact that Eva Smith rebirthed herself as Daisy Renton? She tried to start a new life for herself with a fresh new identity, but then she ended up dying. A daisy is a great piece of symbolism to represent that life cycle. The common flower meaning could be to do with her working class background again. She's common, like the flower, and maybe the upper classes see her as a weed, even though she may be beautiful inside or out. The Birlings certainly seem to treat her as if she's a weed that needs stamping out. One tradition that I found when researching was that people often give daisies to new mothers, but also there was an old Celtic tradition of growing daisies for the spirit of a child who dies at birth. So could this foreshadow the death of Eva and Eric's baby? Well, what about a surname Renton? Well, if we take the first part, rent, it can mean the payment for the use of something, as in when you rent something out. Or rent could be a large tear in a piece of fabric. But how can we attribute meaning to these definitions? Well, possibly we could say something like Daisy's death ends up putting a rent or a tear in the Birling family. Her death rips the family apart. Or maybe this could be to do with Gerald and Eric's treatment of Daisy, particularly Gerald, where he gives her accommodation, food, and money in exchange for sex. He says that it didn't start this way, but that's how it ended up. Payment for the use of his friend's accommodation. And finally, what can we say about Edna? Well, from the research that I could find, the name Edna has three possible meanings: rebirth, delicate, or wealthy friend. Some are harder to make relevant to the play. That's the tricky part about literature. If Priestley says that every little detail is significant, we need to try and theorise why it might be significant. Maybe the rebirth could be a reference to the new attitudes of her employers after the inspector leaves. Some members of the Birling household have new attitudes, they've been rebirthed. Wealthy friend could be a link to the fact that Edna works for the wealthy Birling family. And delicate could be the status of the working class, or the tensions between classes. Edna is the only working class woman that we see in the Birling household. She's the only working class woman that we actually hear speak in the play. so maybe you could describe the situation around class as quite delicate, fragile even, just like the relationships of the family at the end of the play. So why not add character names and interpretations to your revision cards, along with any extra interpretations that you've thought of. Nomenclature can be an interesting technique to look at, especially when we know that the playwright has publicly stated that every little detail is there for a reason. And that's it for today's video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are there any other interpretations or connotations of character names that you've thought of? What have I missed? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy revising.